Recording in progress.
We're back. Welcome again to Live with the Brand. I'm Ken Eifert, Executive Account Manager. We are live from the worldwide headquarters of beef in Worcester, Ohio at the Certified Angus Beef Culinary Center. I know I've said it many a time, and I'm going to say it again. We want you guys to come out and visit us. Please reach out to someone from our staff and come out and visit us here in Worcester. I know it has been pretty insane lately in the beef market. Really going back to 2020 when the pandemic took off, I can remember local grocery stores selling $5.99 tenderloins, and then all the way up to just recently where we had records on the ribeye, record pricing. And it's been especially tough for our food service partners over the last 6 months to come back from everything they endured during the pandemic and then have some really, really high pricing. So we felt that a session about the market and also identifying some alternative cuts before the holiday season was really, really important. And so that was the reason for this session here today. With the holidays coming, it is extremely likely that we're going to be seeing more increases in pricing. And so it's really, really key to now take a look at some of those other cuts out there, especially with the demand on ribeyes, and see if we can find something for your operation today. So we're going to start with the market update. Mr. Clint Wallencheck is back again. We're going to dive into what's coming over the next few months. And then we're going to turn it over to Dr. Clark, and we're going to look at some alternative cuts. And then we are going to look at some strategies on how to procure beef and really take advantage of the market that we've seen. As always, we will have some Q&A towards the end, so please submit questions into the chat, and we'll try to get into each and every one of those. And then we'll show you some cool resources at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Clint. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon to you. Appreciate it, Ken. Good afternoon to all of you those that are watching us and joining us. Appreciate you being here. As Ken shared, we just want to take a few minutes here before we get into the meat of things, literally, and spend some time just setting the stage a little bit about kind of taking a look back here in the last few months of where the market has been, where supply and availability and some of those things have been, and then kind of talk a little bit about what that may look like moving forward, especially as we study some of those historical seasonal trends on some of these different cuts, not just the cuts that are the focus typically in the fourth quarter, but as we mentioned, some of those alternative cuts as well. But as we start out, first and foremost, let's take a look at the cattle that are running through the system, how many cattle we're processing as an industry. And if we take a look here just over the last 8 weeks, and that's really a good time frame for us to focus in on that we could consider post-COVID. So while not a complete apples to apples comparison, relatively close. And as an industry, when we look at that fed cattle harvest number over the last 8 weeks, we're about 2% down. And so when we think about that, at first that may be a little bit confusing of, well, with all the recovery that's taken place and so forth. But think about your own operations and the challenges you've had, especially with labor, okay? So that being the case, that exact same dynamic carries over with these packing plants. And think about it also on a scale of instead of maybe a few dozen or maybe even a few hundred employees that you may be working with on your team, we're ramping that up in many cases for these plants to several thousand folks that it would take to operate those facilities on a daily basis. And so they're running through the same challenges from a labor standpoint that really the rest of the country is. I think we come in and you might often hear that, well, they can run 6 days a week, which would mean Saturday production as well. And they do try to do that as much as they possibly can, but that really can wear several Saturdays in a row to stay, quote, caught up, let's say. And so, again, attendance becomes a bit of an issue there, maybe on the following Monday if you have been running significant Saturdays. And so that's probably the main driver behind what we've seen. There's obviously the typical housekeeping issues, technical difficulties and things like that in these facilities, but labor is really in the driver's seat as far as what's holding us back and putting us again here at about a -2% over the last couple of months. All that being said, though, when we shift gears a little bit and look at, okay, so the cattle that are coming through the system, how are they performing? And fortunately, quality grade has continued to run extremely strong, both in choice and prime as well. And when we look at the resulting certified Angus beef head counts on a weekly basis, we see that number essentially holding flat. So even though the industry is running at a -2%, for the brand, our production coming through the system is actually running flat year over year. And you can see there over the years what that trend has been as we continue to increase the use of Angus genetics throughout the herd, and we continue to get a higher percentage of those cattle to qualify and meet all 10 of those brand carcass specifications. To this year, we're nearing an average year to date of close to 120,000 head, far beyond the 105,000 head per week that we would have seen last year, and even beyond 2019 there at 112,000 head. And so really in a pretty good position, relatively speaking, to where the rest of the industry is as it pertains to that brand supply. Now that being said, demand continues to be strong, okay? No matter the domestic retail, domestic food service business, or international demand as well. All three of those components continue to run strong, and demand for beef as a whole, and especially that premium beef, continues to run high. So we're going to shift gears here a little bit, and it's important for us, while we're going to talk about beef product, I think it's still important for us to at least have a glimpse or somewhat of a base understanding of where the cattle market is that baseline raw material that we're using. And so you can see there back in March of this past year when COVID would have hit, and kind of the immediate 3 to 4 week trend where prices spiked up and then immediately fell back down as more and more of the COVID components began to unravel this past year. But look at what the trend has been since about June of 2020, just that slow and steady increase. Mainly driven from a demand side, because during COVID, remember, we lost a significant amount of production and, quote, backed up a large number of cattle, several 100,000 head of cattle that we normally would have processed during that time. So even though we've had that burden of extra supply of cattle working through the system, demand has still kept prices marching forward. Now, when you stop where we're at today, it's roughly $1.24 to $1.25 per pound is what we're looking at. But if we try to use the crystal ball of the futures board, and we look at the October and the December contracts to kind of give us at least some idea of where we think cattle will trade here through the end of the year, we have $1.28 per pound is currently, as of yesterday at least, where the October futures contract for fed cattle stood, and then $1.35 for the December futures contract. And so I think that gives us some idea of what the general trend that we can expect as a baseline in the cattle market and how that may translate over into the boxed beef side of things. Now, when we shift gears a little bit and we do look specifically at boxed beef, and what we're looking at here would be the boxed beef cutout. So just as a reminder, that's a weighted average across all of the different cuts and all of the different price points across the entire carcass. And I know we've all been living in it, so this particular graphic shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. But notice the last week, and that was this past week, okay, and how things kind of hit a brick wall and began to level off. And the main driver behind that, one, would be a little bit of fatigue, where a lot of folks that have just been chasing supply and trying to access product and so forth have been very, very aggressive, regardless of price almost. But the other key component we keep in mind is we have Labor Day weekend here just about a week away, right? And so last week would have really, and especially the end of last week, would have represented a time when the majority of that Labor Day business was complete. And so we see a lot of participants in the market take a step back, especially on the retail side. They've covered their needs and made those final purchases for the Labor Day weekend. And so we see some of those prices begin to soften. And I use that word loosely because at these price levels, obviously, soften, it's got a long way to go to get anywhere near back to those historical levels that we're accustomed to seeing. A couple of items that we have to mention as we talk about the fourth quarter from a historical standpoint, and that's ribeyes and tenderloins as we think about holiday parties and Christmas roasts and all those kinds of things. So to start, let's take a look at bone-in export ribs or bone-in ribeyes. Again, just like what we saw in the overall generic cutout this past week, we see that level off right there at about $13 per pound. Essentially all-time record highs for that particular item, far, far out of range for what any 3 or 5 year average may be. And so that's really a bit of the question of the day as we sit here right now is what does that look like come November and December whenever this product demand is going to peak for this particular item again. And I think it's safe to say as we reflect back on the previous 2 years and even years prior to that, that fourth quarter, things get really, really volatile with this particular cut. We may be looking at a couple of weeks here post Labor Day where there may be a little bit of relief and opportunity, both from a pricing standpoint and potentially from an availability standpoint. But safe to say that as it continues, even with that relief maybe coming in the next couple of weeks, as we move in through the rest of the fourth quarter, things are more than likely going to stay aggressive on this rib complex. Tenderloin would be much the same at $17 per pound. Again, leveling off this past week as those buyers begin to step back just a little bit. Probably not much of a short-term relief post-Labor Day that we would see on this item. I should also mention, too, it's very important to think about, this isn't just Labor Day. As we think about how aggressive the food service sector has had to become as the different markets continue to reopen and all those things, these two items would be front and center in that environment as well. But again, fourth quarter on the tenderloins, very, very likely to see some aggressiveness as we move in, especially November and December. And so with that being said and kind of setting the stage, let's shift gears here a little bit and join Dr. Daniel Clark, our meat scientist, to talk about what some of those alternatives would likely be as we move through the rest of the year.
Excellent. Thanks, Clint and Ken, for kind of setting that stage up. I think you guys did an excellent job talking about, and I hate to be a little bit all doom and gloom on this, right? But I think we're all aware that the prices aren't exactly friendly, and the predictions might not be so friendly in the future, which is kind of where we want to take this rest of this time that we have on this Live with the Brand to talk about, well, what can you do about it? How now that you kind of know what we're kind of thinking might hold the future, what can you do about that to kind of maybe mitigate some of those? And I would assume that as you're starting to think about holidays and starting to book parties and so forth, we're getting more into that mindset and that theme. I would assume, again, that most of you in the past have traditionally relied on some of our more traditional middle meats, like we have a ribeye sitting here and the tenderloin that Clint just talked about. And those, I would say, when we look at those pricing graphs that Clint shared, which feel free to jump in if you disagree with this, but I think they're probably, when it comes to those trends, those awkward trends that what we're seeing, they tend to be the most extreme. And as you're booking parties and putting those together, that maybe there's some other alternatives. Maybe there's some other tools that we could actually use to kind of mitigate those prices. That's what we want to focus on. So really quick, let's just discuss the rib and the tenderloin and why they make such a great option, right? We'll start here with the tenderloin. I think we're all pretty much familiar with the tenderloin. It's just a very tender cut, but like we just talked about, the pricing is the problem on the tenderloin. It's always been the problem. It's just a more expensive cut because it's so tender. Now the rib, on the other hand, also, kind of, I would say, America's cut, right? This is what everyone wants to go to that steakhouse, and that ribeye is what they're going after. And it makes sense. Now, there's some other options that we've talked about in the past with the ribeye, how you can break that up and do your spinalis, separate that. Right. But in terms of pricing, that probably doesn't give us much advantages from there. So what the first strategies that we want to get into to talk about kind of how do we mitigate these pricings is, first off, what other cuts are out there? What other options do you have to put something on your menu, for a catering menu, whatever it could be? What other options are there? And I would say, if you want to move that over, I'm going to
chime in too, Daniel, and I want to make sure everybody understands that we are not making a case to where the rib and the tender should be pulled off the list whatsoever. I think there's some of those, I know even within our family, that those ribs are going to be on the Christmas holiday dinner table almost no matter what. Absolutely. But I think from the pricing relief and availability as well, availability and having a little higher insurance of just accessing product, I think also becomes very important in the discussion.
Yep, absolutely. And like I said, the ribeye is one of your most, that's America's steak, right? You don't want to take that off, but what you can do is maybe supplement on your menu, add some specials, whatever it is, to relieve some of that pressure, some of the costs that you're facing with the ribeye. Which again, that's where we kind of want to start here with the strip. I think the strip makes a fantastic opportunity. And maybe to start with, what would make the most sense is let's talk a little about the pricing of the strip. I think you have a graph to show what that's been in the past.
Yep, if we could pull that up. And to that point, if you remember the bone-in rib that we started out looking at just a moment ago, those trade levels were about $13 in the current market. And so when we do the comparison, and you can see here on the strip loin, while, again, still significantly above what those historical levels would be, we're closer to that $9. So potentially we're looking at a $9 to $8 here in the short term, and then also look at what the trend, again, as we move through the fourth quarter, look at what the trend is on in this case, a boneless strip loin as we move through the end of the year. Again, the grills are being turned off, kids are back in school, all those different dynamics that come into play. And I think from a pricing standpoint, a margin and profitability standpoint, as well as that availability component that we talked about just a minute ago, really make a lot of sense to take a look at this strip loin. And to Daniel's point, I think it doesn't have to be an either or. You know, a lot of times we see those ribs and strips used in concert with one another, again, just to take some of the pressure off of that ribeye complex.
Yep. And let's just take a second to talk a little bit about science. Like, why does the strip loin make a good alternative to, say, the ribeye? And I would say that the reason for that is, in actuality, they're the same muscle. Both the strip loin and the ribeye are, when you look at a carcass, they're actually connected. We find that the front end of the strip connects right to the back end of the rib. The only thing that separates these two, we always say, is a knife mark. They're literally the same muscle. So when we think about eating quality and some of the traits that we get, mouthfeel, all of those different things that go along with the ribeye, we're going to end up with the same thing in the strip loin. The only difference here is, and I know this is a little bit disappointing, that the ribeye has a spinalis, right? And that spinalis does taste amazing, but when you get into the other end of that ribeye, you will have smaller spinalis, and it does fade out when by the time you get back into the strip loin. Yeah. So that's one thing to think about, is they are actually going to be very, very similar in terms of palatability because of the same muscle. Yeah. Now, something else to think about is this one is also very well known. Just like the ribeye is well known, everybody kind of knows what a New York strip is, right? That's another very popular cut that many people really like, can probably consider that their favorite cut. And I would say that's another great just traditional option. And when Clint showed the pricing there, it kind of makes sense to pair those together. Now, I would also say there's some different ways that we could go about cutting this to even make it a little bit more premium. And if you want something kind of special on your menu, maybe it is a special menu, or maybe you just want something to kind of go along with the tenderloin here. This is a good example of that. We can actually take this strip loin and we can actually split that right down the middle and make what's called a split strip, which we have right there. Okay, now we have a couple different options with the split strip. You can cut that into steaks, and we could get right here what's called a strip fillet. Okay, so that is an option. And what I think is really cool, I'm going to bring this one over close. Here's the tenderloin fillet and the split strip fillet. You can see these actually look very, very similar. Okay, they're both just a fillet, a round, circular round cut, loaded with marbling. Okay, and that marbling we know is key for flavor and juiciness, and that is a great option to kind of go right along with the tenderloin. It makes just a great pair.
So thinking about that Christmas dinner table and so forth, and what we would a lot of times see from a ribeye, is it an option to still go ahead and roast an entire strip?
Yes, I would say absolutely. You can come in there and do that, and then to kind of go right along with that is you can actually take this a split strip roast and use that as a carving station. You can roast that whole thing, and again, it just looks very similar, kind of shape-wise, that long tubular shape as the tenderloin. So if you have someone coming up that you can shave that right off as they go along a carving station, that's another excellent option. And also, I would even argue that it's more uniform, right? So this is going to give you that more uniform shape than even what a tenderloin would. So you're going to get more of that, the same carving technique all the way down will give more consistent portion sizes. That's also, I would say, an added benefit of that. But when we roll this back, I would say the biggest benefit here is what we just talked about with the pricing, right? That just, we kind of revisit that one more time. It's an advantage.
$4 a pound could make up a lot of difference, even for the most diehard ribeye fan, right?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's one option. Now, I would venture to guess that most people out there, they either already knew that, or maybe they already have that. They have the three that we just talked about on the menu. But what we want to bring in next is another option. And this one, I would say, some might not be quite as familiar with as we were with the strip. This is a sirloin. This is our center cut sirloin, and there's some ways that we can take this and make it extremely favorable, like we did with the strip. For starters, this right here is going to be a whole a sirloin roast. Over here we have what we'd call baseball steaks and sirloin chateau right here. We'll get into that in just a second, but maybe again the best place to start is on some pricing advantages and where that is in the sirloin.
Absolutely. So we've gone from $13 ribeyes to $9 strip loins in the current cash market, if you will. So now when we talk about top sirloin butts, now we're down to around $5. And even in the most extreme time, kind of that $4 to $5 range here as of lately is what we've come to expect to see out of this. And so I think it's also important too that as we talk about, kind of making these $4 increment jumps going from one item to the next, that keep in mind in typical times, the typical spread between these items would really be a fraction of that. So don't let a $4 spread in the current market and all the crazy dynamics that go along with that be an indicator of what actual palatability and performance and so forth on these cuts would suggest.
I think that's a great point, is that the market doesn't necessarily dictate the eating quality of this, like you're saying.
Right.
That is 100% true, and this, I guess, would be one great argument for that. This sirloin option really does have some favorable cuts it can get. And we're going to start here with this, what we'd call the sirloin fillet. And again, just like what I showed earlier, if you compare this, again, to a tenderloin, it looks very similar. And you can cut this to look to whatever ounce size, we'll talk about that a little bit later, but to whatever ounce size that you want to fit your menu needs. But it does, it comes off very similar. Now I will say that it's not, you should not eat a sirloin and expect to get the same eating experience you're going to get with the tenderloin. Right. They're not the same. The tenderloin is going to be more tender. The sirloin is not going to carry that. But I will say, on the flip side of things, that the sirloin will be more flavorful every day than the tenderloin. So there's some give and take with these. And some people would, I'm one that would actually prefer the increased flavor that sirloin really provides over the increased tenderness in the tenderloin. So that's something to think about as you're weighing the options.
And there are some things we can do to intervene a little bit and help this thing along, correct?
Absolutely, yep. So one thing that you need to be really cognizant of is your aging time, right? Aging time is really important for this. So I would encourage you to make sure that when you're getting it in, that it's going to be aged appropriately. 35 days is pretty awesome with this. You go a little more if you need to. It needs that extra age for that tenderness. So that is really, really important when we talk about the sirloin.
I'm going to back up just a second even to the strip loin, but this cut as well. So we've shown 3 different fabrication styles here with more of the chateau or the individual portion size versus what we'd see here is more of a roast format. From a strip loin standpoint, that's probably one of the things, depending on how you're buying that product. It's going to come as a whole 0x1 strip loin, right? So somewhere between 12 to 16 pounds, somewhere around 13 or 14 pounds on average that we're dealing with. But depending on how you're purchasing your product, if you're buying those whole strip loins, you can do that fabrication obviously in-house. But your supplier is also going to have those multiple options available to you, whether it be portion size on an actual steak or the chateau from a split strip standpoint. Same thing applies here with the top sirloin butt. Lots and lots of flexibility from a fabrication standpoint and the different formats that whether you want to purchase in a center cut top sirloin like we see here and buy that in what I'll say master cases or whole pieces, or allowing your suppliers to handle some of this portioning for you.
Yep. And if you forget, about a few months ago, we actually did a live with the brand specifically focused on that, where we talked about all the different ways that you can actually purchase in a top sirloin. So that's one thing to consider. If you need a refresher, go back. I know we can go back and listen to some of these live with the brands, but go back to that piece of that live with the brand, and you can see all the different ways that's available, and decide what works for you. Like you're saying, maybe you do want to get a whole top sirloin and use the culotte. Maybe you want a 2-piece where they're already broken down if you have a need for that culotte, or maybe you just want the center cut piece to come in, or you can even buy portion control and get individual steaks. So there's all sorts of different options when it comes to that. But I will say, when it comes back to this, right? Again, these make great steak options. But again, if we think about that roasting opportunities, this sirloin chateau is another great option that makes a great roast that you could put on a carving station for some of your holiday parties that you're putting together. So just some ideas and options there with the sirloin.
I noticed you did not display the culotte or the top sirloin cap here. Anything we need to know about there?
I didn't, only because I only pulled one of those out of the freezer. But that would have been another great one that you could have put on there as well, just as another alternative steak option that culotte steak performs very similar to the sirloin strip. And actually, I think we have an image of what that looks like. The culotte steak, or some people might call it the sirloin strip steak, there on the left-hand side, I have it pictured in certified Angus beef prime. Is a fantastic option, and it does perform very well to that, or very similar, I would say, to that strip steak. So that's a great option.
And just like we had the whole center cut top butt cleaned up here from a roasting option, culottes very similar to that, or I guess to the chateau as well.
Yep.
Culotte from a carving station application and things like that. Culottes could serve that function as well as the portion steaks.
Absolutely. So that's another option that you have when you're thinking about alternative cuts. The Denver steak is another one that's going to be up on the top end of the screen, where that actually is coming from. It could come from a couple different places actually. It's the serratus ventralis muscle. It is going to come from either the chuck flap. You can cut that into Denver steaks. The serratus ventralis muscle also goes over top of the chuck roll. So you could actually come in and remove that off the chuck roll and make Denver steaks from that, off the underblade of the chuck roll. And just so you're aware that that particular muscle, and I think we actually had a live with the brand talking about this muscle too, but that also is going to make up the main muscle in our short ribs, both our plate short ribs and our chuck short ribs. So that's going to be very similar to those. Maybe if you make like flanken style ribs, very similar to the Denver steak, just with the ribs still attached. Yeah. So that's another great option when it comes to alternative cuts that might have a little bit more favorable pricing that we kind of think about. And right, do you have any comments on availability or pricing with either of those as we go?
Not so much availability and pricing. What I would say on the Denver is, again, because it either has to be removed from the chuck roll, or because it would have to be a chuck flap, so a boneless chuck flap by itself, which would essentially be just this muscle on its own. And so it kind of depends on what format you would bring it in from a subprimal or raw material standpoint, and some of the dynamics. For instance, if you're going to take it off the chuck roll, and are you going to make ground beef, or what's your alternative with the rest of that chuck roll and so forth. So there are some logistics that need to be considered when we talk about the Denver steak. But again, it's got a couple of different options from a product availability or a base subprimal standpoint that again provides you some of that flexibility. So
yeah, and I will say the Denver steak is not one that you're not going to eat that and think, wow, this tastes just like a strip steak or a filet mignon. Okay, but it's probably not that. It's unique, right? It's going to have its own flavor profile, tenderness. It's a very, very good cut. If you haven't had it, I would highly encourage you to try it. I personally love it. I think it's a great alternative, but don't eat it thinking it's going to taste exactly like the strip steak. In my opinion, it's just different. It's not better or worse. It's different. Yeah. So that's something to keep in mind. Then on the bottom of that same slide, we actually have a picture of a pub steak, or some people might call this a ranch steak. This actually comes from the clawed heart. It's out of the center of the clawed heart, and it makes another great alternative. And I would personally argue that this one even does the best if you can get it certified Angus beef prime. This is a fantastic cut. The clawed heart marbles fantastically. It puts these really fine, very, very fine flecks of marbling throughout, and the steaks that come from that really look amazing. And it's a great option for an alternative cut like this. Now, something to think about as you're moving forward, if you were to go forward with that one, is the aging, like we talked about with the sirloin. Also Absolutely. Incredibly important with this one. Make sure that is going to be aged. You don't want to get something in that hasn't been aged and put that on a plate. That's probably not going to perform up to your expectations. So that is something to consider. Something else that you might even think about on that one is there are some people out there that's using a jacquard on that one, and so that's something else that could be done and might make that a little bit more tender. So there's all sorts of different tools that you have when you're thinking about steaks. Now we also didn't want to ignore there's different roasts and so forth that we could use for our carving stations as well, and there's a couple different options that we have for those. Might be, again, the clawed heart. So instead of cutting that up into our pub or a ranch steak, you could actually leave that as a whole casino roast, is what people will call it, and use that as a roasting option or as a carving station would be a great one, or even the tri-tip. And I think that Clint even has some graphs in there that kind of talk a little bit where that is pricing-wise on these two cuts.
Yeah, I think especially now we start to get, so remember what we just talked about on the top sirloin butt, roughly a $5 range right now, and so you can see we're getting now closer down to that $4 range. So slowly but surely kind of going down the stair steps. And so from a clawed heart here, from a yield standpoint, really, really solid. The way that product would come in, again, you can have your supplier portion it or apply additional workmanship to those cuts if you desire, but also one that, especially if you're going to bring it in from a roasting standpoint, is almost a ready to go straight out of the bag component, but somewhere in that 4 to 4.5, and you can see relatively flat this year. Again, while the levels are higher, not nearly as susceptible to the seasonal component that we would see, again, where we started with the ribs and the tenders and so forth. So probably relatively stable from as we think about things like an LTO and things like that, whether it be the Claude Hard or any of the items from an alternative standpoint. I think not just the banquet and holiday application, but even LTOs through this time just to help manage the day-to-day business and the day-to-day menu. From a tri-tip standpoint, what we have here is actually the peeled. So the peeled tri-tip is the version of this cut that was reflected in the photo that was up on screen. There's also the fat on option, which would lower these price points just a little bit. I know a lot of folks on the West Coast in particular are going to prefer that fat on option as opposed to a peeled. So either way, whichever format you're looking at, you just need to make sure you're adjusting price point accordingly. But here you can see, again, that seasonal component that not so much impacted from a Labor Day standpoint as far as the holidays. It's more the early spring or spring and early summer time frames that we're looking at as far as where we see the most aggressive price points on the tri-tip. So probably about as good as an opportunity today is what we will see through the end of the year. Again, putting us in that $5 to $6 range for a peeled tri-tip here on the current market. And so I think, again, the versatility, the price points, bundling all these things together, no matter if it's the steak option, the roast option, lots and lots of flexibility that would just challenge everybody to make sure they're taking a look at and exploring whether or not it fits your particular menu, your themes, things like that, your applications and so forth. Leave that up to you. But
Yep. And that's the key is we're really hoping that we hit you guys with this information at enough time before the holiday seasons that really you can adjust as needed. You can make changes to your menus to really prepare for what's ahead during this holiday season coming up with some of these different alternative cuts and bring in what you need to make your business successful. And along with that, there's other ones, right? We didn't talk about all the cuts in the carcass. There's so many different other ones. Some of them might make good options for carving or steak options. Some of them might not. But like the flank, that's another good one.
absolutely. And we actually have a graph here again. Just want to keep these price points in the back of our mind. And so I think the flank is one that, while similar to what we just looked at, has had some volatility here earlier on in the year, but from now through the end of the year, if anything, would expect it to see more or less of a downtrend. Just again, as we're cooling off temperatures and things like that, grilling season is where this cut tends to accelerate as far as its popularity and so forth. But I think the application, no matter if we're talking about something from an ethnic application all the way down to, again, the carving station application. A little bit different. If you've not tried or experimented with this cut, definitely want to bring a few of those in and play around with them and see, how it performs from a texture, flavor standpoint and what your ultimate goals are. But I think as we're talking about those price points, being in that $5 to $6 range, and as you can see, this is one of the very few items across the carcass that has actually come back down to historical levels. And really has just been a little bit insulated here as of lately to what some of that volatility that most of the other cuts we've talked about have seen, and with that downtrend that we would typically expect to see from a seasonal standpoint through the end of the year. And so make sure that as we wrap up this today here in just a few minutes, reach out to our team, whether it be Daniel and I or your account manager, your brand manager, whoever that may be, and be more than happy to have discussions with you specific to the flank or some of the other cuts. That being said, there are some other cuts that, for those of you that use them, the story is the exact opposite. At all-time record highs, the outside skirt would be one that I would throw out that would definitely not be one. Not only is it a little bit more restrictive from an application standpoint, but those that like and need it have helped keep the price points on an outside skirt. So a much different story than what we see here with the flank in particular.
Exactly. And I think that the main takeaway there is be creative, right? Be creative with your menus. And come back to us if you have questions. If you want to know what's the trend on some particular cut, whatever it is, that's where we'd love to talk to you some more. We have these graphs for many of the cuts that are out there. We can give you that information as you need it. So reach out to us, and we'd love to talk more about that moving forward. Now, we also want to give you some other tools. Switching up a cut is one method for how we can manage some of these prices, but that's not the only one. And in fact, we don't always encourage that. There's other options out there. Maybe you have that rib on your menu and you know that your customers need that rib. Well, what other options do you have? You can't switch it out. Well, frozen steaks might be a great opportunity for you. And in fact, I don't know if you realize this, but frozen steaks can in fact be about 15 to 20% more tender than steaks that have never been frozen. We can get into science behind that all you want. I'd encourage you to reach back out if you want to talk more about that.
That's a different session.
Yeah, exactly. But that's something that you really could consider as you're trying to manage these prices. We would just encourage you to reach out to your distributor and find out what they might have available. What frozen product do they have? What can they help you with and to help you maintain your inventory as well?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think I can't emphasize that enough, that for anyone that maybe have given a negative notation to freezing product and so forth in the past, make sure, and Daniel said it, make sure you're engaging with your distributors. I know the licensed distributors that we've talked to over this past year and so forth, one of the common themes that seems to have come from it is they're just looking for ways to help the customer base survive and potentially even thrive as we've gone through this recovery. And I think knowing that freezing product, whether it be in portion steak format or whole subprimal format, is a tremendous tool if they are allowed, or if the customer base allows those distributors to use it, in the flexibility that it can provide from a pricing standpoint, and volatility and so forth, product availability, all of those things. And as long as they're managing that process correctly as far as freezing and thawing and temping that product out and so forth, from a palatability and product performance standpoint, it's not going to skip a beat whatsoever. So I think that's just, again, that's important. Let's make sure we're using all the tools in the toolbox, so to speak.
Yep. And actually, if you want to pass this down, we're going to pull up another board here. So one more tool in our toolbox is going to be portion control. And this is one where I think it's a little bit counterintuitive, right? We think DIY, that's kind of the mentality that we live in these days, is DIY. You see that phrase posted everywhere. And people have that same mentality when thinking about steaks, is, well, I can cut it cheaper and I can cut it better than what I could if it was already pre-cut by the time it got to my restaurant. And that's what I would encourage you is, we're not putting out a sales pitch for portion controlled product. That's not the goal here. But I would say the take-home message from this is ultimately to try it, right? To run the analysis, to go do the math and figure out what is going to be the best method for you. This is a time when labor's at an all-time short, right? We all know that labor is a big problem right now. Plus the pricing phenomenon that's going on. This is a time where you really need to do your homework and do the math. Figure out what is the yield you're getting and what does that compare. This is actually a tenderloin that I broke down this morning. And what you can see here, I would say is most important, is this back. Okay, this piece right here, this one. That's all the trim that came along with this tenderloin. And that's what people tend to forget when they're going to go and buy the tenderloin and cut the steaks themselves. They forget about this part, right? And in fact, if we look at this, it actually made up 38% of the entire tenderloin was trim. Okay, that is with you cutting. That is with me cutting. Yes, that is. So that's something to consider. Is that, and this is an N of 1, right? So every cutter is going to be slightly different, and that's something that we just need to think about as you're moving forward. Is run the math and determine where is it going to be. Where is this going to be a cost savings, or is it going to be actually cost you more to cut your own steaks? Remember that when you're working with your distributor and so forth, the processors out there, you might only be interested in the center cut steaks, okay? And you have to find homes for these if you're cutting them yourself. Whereas someone else, if you're working with actually a processor or distributor, they might already have homes for these. They don't have to work hard to sell it. So they're not going to be supplementing the cost of this for that reason. So that's something just to consider, that you have to put into the pencil and paper to do the work to actually determine this. So again, it's not a sales pitch. It's just asking you to go back and do the homework.
And that's on top of all the additional benefits from an inventory control, product consistency, all those kinds of things that are typically built into portion control programs as well.
Yep, labor. I mean, didn't take a long time, but just to do one tenderloin takes a little bit of time to cut those steaks. And like we said, labor's already a problem. So just getting rid of that person to have to do this is a benefit in and of itself. So make sure you're thinking about those little things as you are putting the paper to pencil. And I would encourage you to do that as you go back and just think about the upcoming holiday season. Yeah. So I have one more thing I'd like to show. Okay, these are tenderloins, and these are different portion tenderloins. So in the back, we actually have 12 ounce, a 10 ounce, an 8 ounce, and a 6 ounce. And what we would encourage you to think about is, as we know, again, prices are just high, and we expect the challenges to still be there for a few months, is to think about the portion size that you're putting on the menu. Could you, in fact, if you're serving maybe a 12 ounce tenderloin, could you reduce down to a 10 ounce tenderloin? Is that something that you could make a change in your menu to save yourself a little bit of money? Is that something your customers are going to really put a lot of weight on and determine if they're going to come back to your restaurant and so forth? It's just something that you need to think about, right? That's to just kind of manage some of the costs, the ultimate costs that you're going to end up putting on there. Is that an opportunity for you?
Yeah, especially again from an availability standpoint, from menu pricing for sure, but I think a lot of what we're seeing today, I know I've experienced it myself a little bit, is I'd rather have at least, even if it's a smaller portion size or whatever it is, as folks are trying to get out and so forth, at least something that's going to cover that particular offering from an entree standpoint, as opposed to absolutely nothing. Yep. And then for sure the price points and so forth that may be more beneficial that go along with that. So
absolutely.
So I'm going to jump in real quick. We didn't really mention it earlier, but if you have questions over anything that we've talked about, we are going to take some time here before we wrap up and answer whatever questions you may have. So go ahead and jump in the chat. We've got some folks behind the scenes that are keeping an eye on the chat, and we'll bring those questions out to us, and we'll absolutely take some extra time to visit about what those may be. I think with that.
Yeah, and if I want to jump in here, let me be the first to say to you guys, gentlemen, that was awesome. Weaving in the graphs, weaving in the product, well done. I know our audience probably is going to really appreciate that. One little anecdote here, I was actually out to dinner last Friday night to a restaurant. The owner was walking around the entire restaurant checking on every single table. And you think back to the portion cut, what allows him to do that is a lot of that product he was bringing in was portion cut steaks. We're not saying you got to do them all. But if we look at this chart that we have here, our team can help you identify maybe which steak you guys should look at for using portion cut. You know, the tenderloin is a pretty easy one to kind of pick on with all that fat that you see kind of listed out on the bottom right there. But maybe it's other ones. Maybe it's only that one, and you can still get your hands on steak cutting that a lot of operators love to do. So we have resources out there. Our team can help you kind of break that down and do a cost analysis, which you kind of see on the right there. Along with that, and Daniel touched on it a little bit too, is menu pricing. We're seeing a lot of operators switch over to using QR codes, and our team has been assisting them with that, and that allows you to keep those menu prices interchangeable. So if you see a big increase on your ribeyes per se, you can make those adjustments that are needed to make sure you're getting those dollars and cents that you take back to the bank. And then also just using market pricing. Some restaurants are now just listing their price as market. With so much fluctuation this past year, it's a good idea to consider those things going forward. Few other resources we have here. We have cut sheets on every single one of those items that Clint and Dr. Clark just walked through. Here's an example on the sheet here of the tri-tip. We can dive into those. Show you proper ways to cut those if you are using them in a carving station, and along with the recipe ideas that our chefs come up with day in and day out, we can dive into that. Carving station, here's a look at a sheet we did this past winter where we identified the traditional steaks you see there, what we call the tried and true, but on the flip side of that, it's clods and tri-tips, and other recipe ideas on some of the steaks they just went over, the casino roast, identifying how much you need for those holiday special you guys are offering. We also are going to have another winter merchandising sheet coming out shortly. You'll be getting a follow-up email on that, and that's going to dive into the pricing structure on particularly those middle meats. So you'll get that in an email to follow this event. We do have a question. It says, how can we get our hands on this market information? Great question. You know, I would start with your executive account manager or your brand manager. We have a lot of those resources available, and then if need be, we'll tie in Clint. We can make a custom event to you. We can cater it to your business, identify what exact steaks you guys are using, and we can dive into every single one of those charts that Clint referenced earlier and really cater it to you. So please reach out to our team. We would love to set up some sort of unique visit just for you, whether that's here in Worcester or something done over virtual or over at your operation as well. We have those resources. Another question, have we seen this high for ribeyes? Clint, do you want to hit on that one?
Sure, yeah. That's absolutely the popular question this time of year. I would say in the short term, yes. And what I mean by that is simply what we touched on earlier about the fact that that Labor Day business puts quite a bit of pressure on the ribeyes. And so in the short term, with Labor Day business being complete, we'll likely see ribeyes at least mellow out here. Again, short term being weeks, not months, okay? But I think, again, as we get into the later part of the year, November, December in particular, is probably when there's always going to continue to be that short-term demand. And very likely, if the seasonal pattern holds, we will probably at least meet, if not exceed, for those lower volumes or likely lower volumes of spot market business for the last couple of months of the year. And that's one of the things that's really been, again, it's always the question of the day this time of year, what the rib market is doing and what does availability look like and all those great things. And I think that does come back to the frozen product component. I think that's one that it's always hard to tell exactly how much product has been put away, potentially in a frozen state, especially as we saw it come down about $3 from the 4th of July highs that we saw earlier this year. We saw about a $3 reduction, and so I would venture that there were a number of suppliers that probably put some ribs away during that time frame as we built back up then, or before we built back up into that Labor Day peak again. And so have we seen the highs? Probably a very good chance, again, follow that seasonal pattern, and we'll see those rib and tenderloin prices as well probably become elevated again here as we move into November and December. Just my guess.
Very good. Get your crystal ball out. Well, we do have a poll question we want to throw out for you guys. We are really excited to announce we have a November event coming for Live with the Brand. And we have a few different topics up here that we want you guys to vote on and decide which one you guys would like to see for our November session of Live with the Brand. So we want to get those in right now.
Are write-in ballots allowed?
Write-in ballot? No.
Well, feel free. If you do have thoughts or suggestions, give us an email. We'd love to hear what your thoughts are. If you have a particular session in mind, send them in. Send them our way. We could tailor it to whatever the needs are.
Yeah, and again, that goes back to just reaching out to our team and setting up an appointment catered to your business and your operation. All right.
Great. Well,
We good? We got enough?
looks like they let us off easy on questions today.
Yes, they did. Well, with that, thank you guys all for joining, and we'll see you in November on the next Live with the Brand. Thank you all. Have a great day.
Thank you.